There are some doors in this world that stay locked because the key is lost, and there are some doors that stay locked because everyone left alive is afraid of what is on the other side. The Blue Fern Motel had 13 rooms along a single concrete walkway facing the highway, and 12 of them have been opened, cleaned, and rented at one point or another over the past 38 years. Room 12 had not. Room 12 had been padlocked from the outside since the spring of 1987, and the woman who held the only key had carried on a chain around her neck for the rest of her life and had told no one, not her husband, not her son, not the priest who came to give last rites, what was inside. She left the chain to me in a sealed envelope, and she left the motel to me in a will so short the lawyer read it twice to make sure he had not skipped a page. My name is Hollis Ardent. I am 51 years old. I had not been back to Cope County, Tennessee in 26 years when the lawyer's letter found me, and I would not be telling you any of this if the dust under that padlock had not finally been disturbed. If this is the kind of story that pulls you in, the kind that starts in a quiet place and ends with the kind of truth that rearranges a whole family, then settle in with us. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We tell these stories because the people who live them deserve to be remembered, and the people listening deserve to know they are not the only ones who have ever stood in front of a locked door and wondered if they had the courage to open it. I want to start where my aunt started, because the motel was hers before it was anyone else's. Her name was Delphine Ardent, and she was my father's older sister by 9 years. She had built the Blue Fern in 1971 with money. She had saved waiting tables at a truck stop in Chattanooga and money she had inherited from a great-aunt nobody else in the family had bothered to visit in the nursing home. She bought a long, narrow strip of red clay land off the old state highway about 4 miles outside the town of Pigeon Hollow, a town small enough that the post office and the grocery store shared a parking lot. And she put up a 13-room motor lodge with her own 2 hands and the help of a black carpenter from over in Sweet Gum named Ezra Whitfield, who had built half the porches in the county and was the only man Delphine ever fully trusted with a level. She painted the doors a soft turquoise she called Blue Fern, after a plan her mother used to keep on the kitchen windowsill, and she hung a hand-lettered sign at the highway that said simply Blue Fern, vacancy, pool, and she opened for business on the first day of June 1971, with the radio playing to the office window and a single car pulled in by sundown. The motel did all right for a while. The state highway out front had not yet been bypassed by the new 4-lane, and a steady trickle of truckers, fishermen on their way down a lake, and traveling salesmen kept the rooms turning over enough to keep the lights on. Delphine ran the front office herself. She made the beds herself. She mopped the long concrete walkway every Sunday morning before church, even when church was the last place she was planning to go. She was a tall woman with strong hands and a way of looking at a stranger that let them know, without a word being spoken, exactly how much foolishness she was prepared to tolerate, which was none. Around town, people called her Miss Delaware. They said she was hard but fair. They said her coffee was the best on the highway. They said she did not suffer fools, and she did not bend her rules, and she did not let anyone in this world tell her how to run a business that her own back had built. What people did not say out loud, but what everyone in Cope County knew the way small-town people know things, was that Delphine Ardent had once been engaged to a man named Press Halloran, and that Press Halloran had broken the engagement 2 weeks before the wedding, and that he had married a girl from Jasper County instead, and that he had then become sheriff of Cope County for 16 years before passing the badge to his nephew, who passed it to his son, until Halloran was a name that meant law in this part of the state, the way some names mean money in others. Delphine had never married. She had never spoken Press Halloran's name in my hearing. She had run her motel and tended her own life and asked nothing of anyone. And the only family she had kept close was my father, Caleb Ardent, who lived 20 miles away in a little blockhouse on a creek and who came every Tuesday evening to eat supper at her kitchen table behind the office. I came too when I was a child. That is the part of this I have to tell you, so that you understand the rest. I came every Tuesday with my father from the time I was 4 years old until I was 12, and I sat at Aunt Dell's table and ate her chicken and dumplings and listened to her, and my father talk about the weather and the price of feed and the man who had stiffed her on her room 2 weeks ago. And after supper, she would let me run up and down the long concrete walkway out front, counting the turquoise doors, sometimes pressing my ear to one to see if I could hear anything inside, sometimes peeking. Through a window if the curtain was open. I knew every room in the Blue Fern by the time I was 8 years old. I knew which door stuck in the summer heat, and which one had a brass kickplate, and which one had a chip in the paint shaped like the state of Florida. And I knew, because every child who spent any time at that motel knew, that room 12 was not a room you went near. The padlock on room 12 was the size of a man's fist. Aunt Dell had put it there herself, and she had told me once, and only once, when I was 9 and had asked her why, that some doors are closed for reasons grown people do not always explain to children, and that this was one of those doors, and that she would thank me to walk past it the way I walked past a cemetery, with respect and without stopping. I walked past it that way for the rest of my childhood. Then I grew up, and I moved away, and I did not come back. I moved to Knoxville at 19 and to Indianapolis at 25, where I worked for a long time as a hospital coding specialist. The kind of job where you read a chart someone else has written and turn it into the numbers an insurance company needs. It was steady and quiet, and the only thing it required of me was the ability to be left alone in a room with a stack of paper. I was good at it. I was married briefly in my 30s to a man named Devin who was kind and reasonable and who left me, finally, because he said I had a wall around me that he could not find a door in, and because he wanted children, and because I did not. I did not blame him then, and I do not blame him now. I had grown up watching Aunt Dell live alone behind a desk in an office with a buzzing neon sign, and I had absorbed, somewhere the way children absorb the temperature of a room, without being told it, that there were women in the Ardent line who were built for other things, and that I was one of them. My father died in 2014. Aunt Dell came to the funeral in a black coat I had never seen her wear. She sat in the back of the chapel with her hands folded in her lap, and her face composed in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of grief. After the service, she came up to me and put one hand on my arm and said only, "He was a good brother to me. You should come home sometime." Hollis, I told her I would. I did not. The years pass the way they pass when you have decided, without ever quite deciding, that the past is a country you are not going to visit anymore. I sent Christmas cards. She sent Christmas cards. Once, in 2019, she sent a photograph of the Blue Fern with a note on the back that said roof held up another winter. So did I. I put the photograph in a drawer, and I did not write back, because I did not know what to say to a woman who had built a thing with her own hands and was watching it weather down to its bones. I knew, even then, that the motel was not what it had been. The new 4-lane had come through in 1991 and pulled the traffic away from the old state highway. Aunt Dell had hung on past the point most people would have closed the doors. She had taken in long-term tenants for cheap rent, old men with disability checks, women fleeing situations they did not name, and she had kept the lights on and the office staffed alone for 30 more years out of stubbornness I did not fully understand until much later. She died in February of this year. The lawyer's letter came on a Wednesday. Pneumonia. 84 years old. In her own bed in the back of the office. She had left no instructions for her funeral and no notes of family and no particular request for anyone living, except that her great-niece, me, was to inherit the Blue Fern Motel, the 4.5 acres it sat on, the office contents, and one sealed envelope to be opened only by the legal heir alone. The lawyer was a man named Roy Petway, who had handled Aunt Dell's affairs for 20 years, and who did not, when I called him, sound surprised that I had not been back. He told me the will was simple and the property was clear of liens, and he told me that the envelope was in his office safe, and he told me that there was something I should know before I came down. Your aunt left a note on the outside of that envelope, he said. It says, "For Hollis. Read alone, then go to room 12. I sat in my Indianapolis apartment with the phone against my ear and looked out the window at a parking lot full of someone else's cars, and I felt the first cold thread of something I had not felt in a long time, which was a sense that a story I had spent my whole adult life walking away from had circled back around a long way and was now waiting for me at the door. I drove down the next morning, 11 hours through Indiana and Kentucky and into the green-brown hills of East Tennessee, the radio off most of the way, my hands tight on the wheel. I came into Cope County in the late afternoon, the light slanting low over the cattle pastures and the kazoo-strangled fence lines, and when I passed the old Welcome T.O. Pigeon Hollow sign, I felt a small, sharp pull in my chest that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with the way a body remembers a place even when the mind has done its best to forget. The town had not changed much. The post office was still attached to the grocery. The diner on the corner still had its Coca-Cola sign. The only new thing I could see was a Dollar General on the south end and a billboard for a real estate company called Halloran Land and holdings that advertised, in big confident letters, "We buy land. Cash. Fast. Family owned for 3 generations." I drove out the old state highway, and I saw the Blue Fern from a quarter-mile away. The sign was still up. The turquoise paint had faded to the color of a robin's egg left too long in the sun. The asphalt of the parking lot was cracked and patched and cracked again. I pulled in slow, and I sat in my car with the engine off for a long minute, and I looked down the long concrete walkway at the row of doors. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3, all the way down. Room 12 still had its padlock. I could see it from the parking lot, black and heavy and sigh for a man's fist, just the way I remembered. The paint on the door behind it had blistered and peeled in long curls, and the curtain in the window was the same curtain that had hung there in 1987, sun-rotted now to the color of weak tea. Nothing else on the property looked like it had been touched in a year. That door looked like it had not been touched in nearly 40. I went into the office. The bell over the door still rang the same flat note. The room smelled of old coffee and pine cleaner, and something deeper underneath, something that was just the smell of a building that had been lived in by one person for a very long time. The keychain was lying on the desk where Roy Petway had left it for me, with a note in his small, careful handwriting that said, "Welcome home, Miss Ardent. The envelope is in my office whenever you are ready." I picked up the chain. The key on it was small and brass and dull with age. I closed my hand around it, and I stood in the empty office of the Blue Fern Motel, and for the first time since the lawyer's letter had arrived, I let myself understand that whatever Aunt Dell had been carrying for 38 years, she had just handed to me. I drove back into town, and I went to Roy Petway's office on the second floor of the bank building, and I sat in a leather chair across from a man in his late 60s who looked at me with the mild, careful kindness of a man who had been delivering hard news to families his entire working life. He slid the envelope across the desk. It was thick manila, sealed with a strip of clear tape that had yellowed. On the front, in Aunt Dell's hand, that strong, slanted hand I would have known anywhere, were the words Hollis. "Read alone, then go to room 12. Take it home," Roy said. "Read it tonight. If you have questions tomorrow, come back. There are some things in there you may want to talk through with somebody, and I am willing to be that somebody if you want me to be. But your aunt was very specific, that you read it alone first." I asked him if he knew what was in it. "I know what is in the legal portion," he said. "I drew that part up myself 2 years ago. I do not know what is in the personal portion. She wrote that one in her own hand, and she sealed it herself, and she told me that if I opened it before you, that she would come back from wherever she was and have a word with me about it." I believed her. I drove back to the motel with the envelope on the passenger seat. I sat in the office until full dark, and then I locked the front door, and I went into the small back apartment where Aunt Dell had lived, and I sat down at her kitchen table under the same yellow ceiling light I had eaten chicken and dumplings under as a child, and I broke the seal on the envelope, and I began to read. What was inside that envelope is the rest of the story. But before I tell you what Aunt Dell had been carrying, I have to tell you about the people who came to find me before I had even finished reading her letter. Because Cope County is a small place, and word travels through it the way water travels through a cracked foundation, and by the time I had been in the Blue Fern Motel for 16 hours, 3 different members of the Halloran family had already turned into my parking lot, and one of them had already made me an offer. The first one came on Thursday morning, a little before 9. I had been up most of the night with Aunt Dell's letter, and I was sitting in the office with the door propped open and a mug of coffee going cold in my hands when I heard the gravel crunch under tires. A late-model black pickup truck pulled in slow, parked diagonally across 2 of the faded parking spaces, and a man got out who was, in every visible particular, the kind of man who had spent his entire life never having to wait in line. He was somewhere in his middle 50s. He was tall and broad to the shoulders and slightly heavy through the middle in the way of men who used to do physical work and have spent the last 15 years sitting behind a desk instead. He wore a starched blue shirt with the cuffs rolled twice, dark jeans, and a pair of cowboy boots polished to a finish that no working man's boots ever achieve. His hair was steel gray and combed back from a tanned forehead. He had a class ring on his right hand and a wedding ring on his left and a smile already arranged on his face before he had even reached the office door. "You must be Hollis," he said, coming in without knocking, the bell over the door clattering behind him. "I am Garrett Halloran. I knew your Aunt Delphine for 40 years. I am awful sorry for your loss." He held out his hand. I stood up and shook it because I had been raised to, and I felt the size and the dryness of his palm, and I noted, the way you note the temperature of a room, that his grip was firmer than it needed to be. "I appreciate that," I said. "I will not take much of your time," he said, settling himself into the chair across the counter, without being invited to. "I know you just got in. I know you are going through a lot. I just want to come by personal and tell you that whatever you decide to do with this property, my family would be honored to be a part of that conversation. We have been buying land in Cope County for 3 generations. My daddy was a sheriff here for 16 years. As I imagine you know, my grandfather was on the county commission, and my company, Halloran Land and Holdings, has been the largest private landholder in this part of the state since 1998. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. The eyes were doing something different. The eyes were taking inventory. They moved across the office, the old desk, the rotary phone Aunt Del had kept until the day she died, the framed photograph of the Blue Fern on opening day in 1971, and they came to rest on me, and they did one quick, complete read of who I was and what I was likely to do, and then the smile widened a little, the way a smile widens when a man has just confirmed that the situation in front of him is exactly as manageable as he had assumed it would be. "I will be straight with you. Hollis," he said, "this property is not what it was. The traffic count on this stretch of highway has been falling for 30 years. The buildings are at the end of their useful life. The well is going to need replaced inside of 5 years, and the septic was put in before I was born. Your aunt was a stubborn woman, and I mean that with all due respect. She was a fine lady, but she was holding on to something that the market had moved past. Now that you are the owner, I would imagine you're looking at this and asking yourself what on earth you're going to do with it." He paused. He let the question hang there, the way a salesman lets a question hang when he is waiting for the customer to arrive at the answer he has already decided on. "I have not decided anything yet," I said. "I have been here about 16 hours. "Of course," he said. He held up both hands, palms out. "Of course. I am not asking you to decide today. I am only telling you that when you are ready to have that conversation, my company is prepared to make you an offer that will let you walk away from this place clean. No headaches, no demolition costs, no year of dealing with the county over the septic. We would handle all of it, and the number we are prepared to offer. And Hollis, I am telling you this as a courtesy, not as a negotiation. The number is going to be considerably more generous than what an outside buyer would put on the table for a property in this condition." "What is the number?" He smiled again, a different smile this time, the smile of the man who'd been asked the question he was waiting for. $240,000. Cash. We can close in 30 days. You sign the papers, you take the check, you go back to Indiana, and you never have to think about Cope County again." I sat with that for a long moment. The coffee in my hand had gone fully cold. Outside, a single mockingbird was working through its repertoire on the power line above the parking lot. "That is a generous offer," I said. "It is the most generous offer you're going to get," Garrett Halloran said. "And I will be straight with you about why. There is a piece of land directly behind this property. You cannot see it from the highway because of the tree line that my family has owned since the 1950s. We are looking at a development project that runs from a highway frontage back through that parcel, and the Blue Fern sits right in the middle of it. We need this property. We are willing to pay above market to get it. But the offer is good for 30 days, Hollis, and after that the project moves forward without it, and you are going to be sitting on 4.5 acres of land with 13 falling down rooms and a septic system that is going to fail in the next bad freeze, and there will not be another buyer because there will not be a project for that buyer to be a part of." He said all of this in a tone of friendly concern. He said it the way a doctor tells a patient that surgery is the only option, and as I sat there listening to him, I understood 2 things very clearly. The first was that everything he had just said was almost certainly true in the small particulars, and almost certainly a lie in the shape of the whole. The second was that Garrett Halloran had walked into this office expecting to find a 51-year-old woman from Indiana who had not been in Cope County in 26 years, who did not know the land, did not know the family, did not know the history, and who would be relieved to take any number that let her walk away. He had walked in expecting to find an easy mark. He had not. I realized with small, cold satisfaction. Read Aunt Dell's letter. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Halloran," I said. "I will think about it. Garrett, I will think about it. I will be in touch when I have made a decision." He nodded, the nod of a man who was confident that thinking about it would lead, in the natural course of things, to agreeing to it. He stood up, he straightened his cuffs. He gave me a card from a leather case in his shirt pocket. Garrett Halloran, President, Halloran Land and Holdings, LLC, and he walked out the door, and the bell rang behind him, and I watched his black pickup back out onto the highway and pull away in the direction of town. I sat at the desk for a long time after he left. Then I got up, and I locked the office door, and I went down the long concrete walkway to room 12, and I stood in front of that padlock for the first time in my adult life. And I put my hand on the cold black metal of it, and I did not turn the key. Not yet. There were still pages of Aunt Dell's letter I had not finished reading, and I had decided, sometime during Garrett Halloran's pleasant smiling pitch, that I was not going to open that door until I knew exactly what I was opening. I went back to the office. I poured the cold coffee into the sink and made a fresh pot. I sat down at the kitchen table in the back apartment, and I picked up Aunt Dell's letter from where I had left it the night before, and I started reading again from the page I had marked with my finger. The letter was 41 pages long. It was written on yellow legal pads in 3 different inks, which told me she had written across more than one sitting, probably across more than 1 year. The handwriting changed in places, growing tighter and more careful in some sections, looser and more rushed in others. She had numbered the pages in the top right corner. She had also, I noticed when I went back through it later, drawn a small 5-petal flower at the bottom of every page, the way a woman doodles when she is thinking. The flower was a blue fern. She had been signing her own name, page by page, even when she was not signing it. I will not give you the letter word for word, because some of it was meant for me alone, and because Aunt Dell did not believe in writing for an audience that was not in the room with her. But I will tell you what was in it, and I will tell you what I did with it, because that is the part that matters. In the spring of 1986, Aunt Dell wrote, the Blue Fern Motel had been doing well enough that she had begun to think about expanding. She had drawn up plans to add 4 more rooms on the backside of the property, where the land sloped down toward a small creek and a stand of hickory trees. She had gone to the Cope County Bank to ask about a loan. She had been turned down politely, but with finality, by a loan officer who told her, without quite saying so, that the bank had been advised that her property was not a good investment. She had been confused. The Blue Fern was profitable. Her books were clean. Her credit was unblemished. She had been a customer of that bank for 15 years. She had gone home that afternoon, she wrote, and she had sat in her office for a long time, and she had begun to put pieces together that she had not previously thought to put together. 3 months earlier, she had been approached by a man named Boyd Halloran, Garrett's father, who at that time was the sheriff of Cope County, and who had asked her, in the friendly tone of a man who was not asking, whether she would be interested in selling the Blue Fern to a partnership he was putting together with 2 other men in the county. He had named a price. The price had been low. She had said no. He had smiled, and he had said, well, you think on it, Dell, and let me know if you change your mind, and he had left. She had thought no more about it. Boyd Halloran had been a polite man in that meeting. He had not pressured. He had not threatened. But 3 months later, the bank loan had been denied, and a week after that, a county building inspector had shown up at the Blue Fern with a clipboard and a list of things he said needed to be corrected before the property could remain in operation. The list was long. The list was specific. The list contained items that no other motel on that stretch of highway had ever been cited for. Aunt Dell had argued. The inspector had been polite, the way Boyd Halloran had been polite. Just doing my job, ma'am, and he had given her 90 days to bring the property into compliance, and the cost of corrections, when she got estimates, was a little over $20,000, which was almost exactly the amount she would have needed to borrow to expand. She had paid for the corrections out of her savings. She had not expanded. She had understood, by the end of that summer that something was being done to her. That was the spring of 1986. Now I am going to tell you what happened in the spring of 1987, and I am going to tell it the way Aunt Dell told it, because she was specific in her letter about wanting me to know the order of things and the smallness of the choices that had led to a much larger one. In April of 1987, Aunt Dell rented room 12 to a man who signed the register as J. Caldwell. He was in his early 40s, slightly built, soft-spoken, well-dressed in a way that did not quite fit the kind of motel the Blue Fern was. He paid in cash for a week. He kept it himself. He took his meals in town. He drove a maroon sedan with Kentucky plates. Aunt Dell wrote that she had liked him in the small, distant way a motel keeper likes a quiet guest who does not cause her trouble, and that she had not asked him any questions about his business, because asking guests questions about their business was not something she did. On the fifth night of his stay, around 11 o'clock, she heard a vehicle pull into the parking lot fast. She heard a door slam. She heard a man's voice, raised, and then Mr. Caldwell's voice, lower and trying to calm. She got out of bed and put on her robe and went to the office window in time to see two men, one of whom she recognized immediately as Boyd Halloran, even out of uniform, even in the dark, standing in front of room 12 with Mr. Caldwell, who was in his shirt sleeves and his stocking feet. The other man she did not recognize. He was younger, tall, with a heavy build, and a kind of face that looks the same whether it is angry or calm. The conversation was short. Mr. Caldwell was trying to talk. Boyd Halloran was not interested in talking. The younger man hit Mr. Caldwell once in the stomach, and Mr. Caldwell went down on one knee on the concrete walkway, and Aunt Dell, watching from the office window with her hand pressed flat against the glass, picked up the telephone to call police, and then remembered, in the same instant, that the man she was watching beat a guest in her parking lot was a police. She put the phone down. She stood at the window, and she watched. Mr. Caldwell was hauled to his feet. He was hustled into the back seat of a car she had not seen pull in, a dark sedan, parked across the highway. That the younger man must have come in. Boyd Halloran went into room 12. He was in there for nearly 20 minutes. Aunt Dell watched the doorway the entire time. When he came out, he was carrying a leather satchel and what looked, from the office window, like a stack of file folders. He locked the door of room 12 behind with the room's own key, which he had taken from Mr. Caldwell, and he walked across the parking lot to the office door, and he came in. I am going to tell you what he said to her, because she wrote it down word for word, and because it is the kind of thing a woman remembers word for the rest of her life. He said, Delaware, you did not see anything tonight. That man checked out of room 12 this evening, before supper time. You have his signature on the register where he checked out, because you're going to write it there yourself when I leave. Room 12 is going to stay closed. You're going to put a padlock on it tomorrow morning, and you are not going to open it again because there is some private property in there that belongs to me now, and I am going to leave it where it is for the time being, and I do not want it disturbed. If anyone asks about Mr. Caldwell, you tell them he checked out and drove away, and you do not know where he was headed. If anyone asks about room 12, you tell them the plumbing has gone bad, and you have it closed for repairs. You are going to do all of this, Dell, because you are a smart woman, and because you have a brother and a niece you love, and because the alternative to doing this is something neither of us wants to talk about. Do you understand me? She had understood him. She had nodded. She had not been able to make her voice work. He had stood in front of her desk for another long minute, looking at her, making sure. Then he had reached over and turned the register around, and he had pointed at the line where Mr. Caldwell had signed in 5 days earlier, and he had said, Sign him out. Tonight's date. Time of 7 p.m. And she had picked up the pen, and she had forged J. Caldwell's signature on the line below his own, and she had written 7 p.m. checked out, and Boyd Halloran had nodded once, and he had walked out, and she had heard his car start up, and she had heard the other car start up, and she had watched both sets of headlights pull out onto the highway and disappear in the direction of town, and she had sat at her desk in her robe with her hand on the register, and she had not moved for the better, part of an hour. The next morning she went to the hardware store in Pigeon Hollow, and she bought the largest padlock they sold, and she put it on the door of room 12, and she did not open that door again for the rest of her life. Mr. Caldwell was never reported missing. There was no story in the paper. No deputy came around to ask if she had seen anything. Whatever had been wanted from Mr. Caldwell by Boyd Halloran and the man with the heavy face had been gotten that night in the parking lot of Blue Fern, and the rest of it, whatever the rest of it had been handled somewhere else by someone else and had never come back to her door. But the leather satchel and the file folders that Boyd Halloran had taken out of room 12 had not been the only things in that room. Aunt Dell knew this, because 3 days later, when she had finally worked up the courage to walk down the long concrete walkway and stand in front of the locked door, she had remembered something. Mr. Caldwell had asked her, on the second night of his stay, if there was a way to access the crawl space under his room. He had said he had dropped something through a gap in the floorboards near the bathroom. A ring, he had said, sentimental, and he had wondered if there was a way to retrieve it. She had told him there was an access hatch on the back side of the building, behind the bathroom wall, that she would be happy to open for him in the morning. He had thanked her, and he had said no, that was all right. He would just leave it. It was not worth the trouble. She had thought no more about it. Until the morning she stood in front of the locked door room 12 and remembered the conversation, and understood, all at once, that Mr. Caldwell had not dropped a ring. That afternoon, she walked around the back of the motel with a flashlight and a screwdriver, and she opened the access hatch to the crawl space under room 12, and she crawled on her hands and knees in the red Tennessee clay, and she found, wedged up between two floor joists directly under the bathroom of room 12, a brown paper grocery bag. The bag was rolled tight at the top. Inside the bag, she wrote, was a metal box of the kind people used to keep recipes in, and inside the box were three things: a bound ledger, a reel-to-reel audio tape, in a cardboard sleeve, and a sealed manila envelope with the words, "If I am killed, give T.O. TBI" written across the front in a man's careful printed handwriting. TBI, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Aunt Dell had taken the metal box out of the bag, and she had put the empty bag back where she had found it, and she had crawled back out of the crawl space, and she had sat in her office for the rest of that afternoon with the box on the desk in front of her, and she had not opened the envelope, because she understood the way a person understands the weight of a stone before they have lifted it, that whatever was inside that envelope was the kind of thing that a sheriff like Boyd Halloran would do anything to keep from coming to light. She had also understood, and this is a sentence in her letter that I read 4 times before I could move on from it, that if she gave the envelope to the TBI in 1987, she would not survive the week. She had no proof Boyd Halloran had taken Mr. Caldwell out of that parking lot. She had no body. She had only a forged signature in her own handwriting on her own register. She had no allies in the county sheriff's office, because Boyd Halloran was a county sheriff's office, and she had no certainty that the TBI agent who received the envelope would not, in the way of small southern states in 1987, simply pick up the phone and call Boyd Halloran himself before opening it. So she had hidden the metal box. She had hidden it well enough that Boyd Halloran, who came back to motel 3 more times over the following 2 years to make small reminders of his interest in her continued silence, never found it and never knew it existed. She had carried the secret for 38 years. She had watched Boyd Halloran retire from the sheriff's office in 2003 and die of a heart attack in 2009. She had watched his son Garrett build Halloran Land and Holdings into the largest private landholding company in 3 counties on capital that had originated. She had come to suspect, in whatever Mr. Caldwell had been carrying in that satchel, she had watched the Halloran name spread across Coke County like ink and water, and she had kept her padlock on room 12, and she had kept her metal box where she had hidden it, and she had waited, she wrote, for 2 things. She had waited for Boyd Halloran to die, because she had understood that nothing she could say while he was alive would be heard, and she had waited, after that, for the right person to leave it to. "I love your father, Hollis," she wrote, "but Caleb was a soft man and a kind man, and he was not built to carry this. And I love you. I have watched you from a distance for a long time, and I have seen the shape of you, even when you did not come back to see me. You are built like the women in our line. You are built for the cold work. I am sorry to leave it to you. I would have done it myself, if I could have figured out how, but I could not. And now I am out of time, and I am asking you to do for me what I could not do for myself. The metal box is not in room 12. It never was. I moved it the night I found it, and I have moved it twice more in the years since. It is now in the place where, when you were 9 years old, you asked me what was inside, and I told you it was none of your business. Look there. The padlock on room 12 is for the Hallorans, Hollis. I left it there for 38 years to make them think the secret was behind it. The secret was never behind it. The padlock was the misdirection. The secret was always somewhere else. Find it, and then do the thing I could not do. I sat at Aunt Dell's kitchen table with the letter in my hands, and I read that paragraph 3 times, and I understood, somewhere in the middle of the second reading, that my hands were shaking, not with fear, with something else, with the specific clean anger of a woman who has just understood that her aunt, her quiet, hard, unmarried aunt who had run a motel alone for 54 years, had carried a piece of evidence for almost 4 decades because no one in this county had been honest enough or brave enough or far enough outside the Halloran family's reach to be trusted with it, and that the only person Delphine Ardent had finally been able to trust, in the end, was a great niece who lived 11 hours away and had not bothered to come home. If this story is moving you, hit the like button and turn on the bell so you never miss another story like this one. There is more coming, and I am going to tell you exactly what was in that metal box and what I did with it, and what happened in Cope County, Tennessee, when a woman from Indianapolis with a 41-page letter and the right kind of anger walked into the wrong courthouse on a Monday morning. Stay with me. I put the letter down. I went outside. The sun had come up sometime while I was reading, and the long concrete walkway of the Blue Fern Motel was washed in the pale gold light of an early Tennessee morning. I walked down the walkway. I passed room 1, room 2, room 3. I passed room 12 with its padlock and its sun-rotted curtain, and I did not stop. I kept walking, past the end of the walkway, around the back of the building, past the rusted hulk of the ice machine that had not worked since the Reagan administration. I walked out into the side yard, where the grass was thin and the red clay showed through in bare patches, and I stopped in front of a small concrete bird bath that Aunt Dell had put in the year I was 9 years old. I had asked her that summer what was inside the bird bath. I had been a curious child, the kind who turned things over to see what was underneath. I had been crouched next to it one afternoon, prying at the rim with a stick, and Aunt Dell had come out of the office and stood over me with her hands on her hips and said, "Hollis Ardent, that bird bath is not yours, and what is inside it is none of your business. And if I catch you fooling with it again, I will make you spend the rest of the summer washing every window on this property. Do you hear me?" I had heard her. I had not fooled with the bird bath again. I had, in the way of children, simply taken her at her word. What is inside it is none of your business, and I had not, until I read her letter 42 years later, ever once stopped to wonder why she had said what is inside it about a concrete bowl that any reasonable person could see was filled with rainwater and dead leaves. I knelt down beside the bird bath. The bowl was old and weathered, and stained with green moss. I tipped it sideways. It came off its pedestal more easily than I had expected, and underneath the bowl, set into the top of the hollow concrete pedestal, was a square of plywood painted gray to match the concrete. I lifted the plywood out. Underneath, wrapped in 2 layers of plastic sheeting and a layer of oilcloth, was a metal box of the kind people use to keep recipes in. I sat down in the red dirt next to the bird bath, and I put the box on my knees, and I undid the wrappings, and I opened it. The bound ledger was on top. I lifted it out. The pages were yellow but intact, and the handwriting on them, the same careful printed handwriting that was on a manila envelope, was a record of payments received by date, by amount, by source. The amounts were not small. The sources were named. I recognized 2 of the names immediately because they were on a billboard I had passed on the way into Pigeon Hollow the day before. I read down the column of dates. The earliest entry was from 1981. The latest was from a week before Mr. Caldwell had checked into room 12. The ledger documented 6 years of payments from a county-level operation that had been laundering federal land development funds intended for the construction of low-income housing in 3 counties, through a series of shell partnerships, 2 of which had been controlled by Boyd Halloran and 1 of which had been controlled by his brother-in-law, who had sat on the Regional Housing Authority Board. The reel-to-reel tape was underneath the ledger. I did not have a way to play it, but I did not need to, because a manila envelope underneath the tape contained a typed transcript, and the transcript was a recording of a meeting at which Boyd Halloran, identified by name, had explained to Mr. Caldwell, who had been, the transcript made clear, an internal auditor for the Regional Housing Authority, exactly which payments were going to be redirected through which accounts, and exactly which county officials were going to be made aware of the redirection in advance, and exactly what was going to happen to anyone who attempted to report the redirection to federal authorities. The envelope also contained 4 photographs of cashier's checks, made out in amounts ranging from $12,000 to $48,000, drawn on the accounts of the shell partnerships, and endorsed in the back by Boyd Halloran himself. And at the bottom of the envelope was a handwritten note from Mr. Caldwell, dated the day he had checked into Blue Fern, addressed to whom it may concern, that explained that he had been gathering this evidence for 14 months, that he had reason to believe his life was now in immediate danger, that he had concealed copies of these materials in a location he had identified to 2 persons of his trust, and that if these materials were found, and he could not be the persons named in the documents, should be considered responsible for whatever had happened to him. I closed the box. I sat in the red dirt next to my Aunt Dell's concrete bird bath, and I looked across the side yard of the Blue Fern Motel at the long concrete walkway and the row of turquoise doors and the padlock on room 12, and I understood, the way Aunt Dell must have understood standing at her office window 38 years ago, that I was now holding something that was bigger than me, and that I had 2 choices. I could put it back where I had found it, and I could call Garrett Halloran and accept his $240,000 and drive back to Indianapolis and never speak of any of this to anyone. Or I could do what my aunt had asked me to do, and I could not yet see the shape of how that was going to work, but I could see clearly that it was going to require me to be more than I had ever been before. I sat in the dirt for a long time. Then I got up, and I carried the box back to the office, and I locked in the small fireproof safe under Aunt Dell's desk. And I picked up the phone, and I called Roy Petway, and I asked him a single question. "Roy," I said, "is there a single attorney within driving distance of Pigeon Hollow who has never, in any capacity, accepted money from any member of the Halloran family or any company controlled by them?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Roy said, in the slow, careful voice of a man who was beginning to understand that the conversation he was now in was not the conversation he had expected to be in this morning, "Hollis, why are you asking me that?" "Roy," I said, "is there one?" Another pause. Then he said, "There is one. Her name is Marguerite Pell. She is over in Sweet Gum. She is 68 years old. She is half retired. She does mostly civil rights work, and she has spent 30 years suing this county for one thing or another. She is not popular, and she is not rich, and she is the only attorney I know of in 3 counties who has never taken a dime from a Halloran in her life. Do you want me to call her for you?" "Yes," I said. "And Roy, I wanted to tell her that I have something I need her to look at, and I want you to tell her that I am going to need it looked at by somebody with federal jurisdiction, because the county is not where this gets handled. Do you understand me?" There was a third pause, longer than the first 2. Then Roy Petway said very quietly, "Hollis, what was in that envelope your aunt left you?" "Roy," I said, "call Marguerite Pell." Marguerite Pell drove to the Blue Fern Motel that same afternoon. She came in a faded green Subaru that had a bumper sticker on the back that said "Equal Justice Under Law," and another one underneath it that said, "I know my rights. Ask me about yours." She was a small woman with iron-gray hair pulled back in a single braid, brown skin weathered by 68 Tennessee summers, and a pair of reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She came into the office. She shook my hand. She sat down across from me at the desk, and she said, "Roy Petway has been my friend for 30 years, and he has never once called me about a Halloran matter. He called me about you this morning. So before we go any further, Miss Ardent, you are going to tell me what you have, and you're going to tell me the truth, and you are going to tell me all of it. I am too old, and I have too much to lose to be brought into something halfway. Are we clear?" We were clear. I told her everything. I read her the letter, the parts of it that were not personal. I opened the safe, and I laid the contents of the metal box on the desk between us, and I watched her go through them. The ledger, the transcript, the photographs of the cashier's checks, the handwritten note from Mr. Caldwell. She read everything twice. She put her glasses on and took them off 3 different times. When she was done, she sat back in the chair, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at me for a long, quiet moment, and she said, "Miss Ardent, do you understand what you are holding?" "I think I do." Tell me what you think you understand. I think I am holding evidence that the former sheriff of this county and several of his associates orchestrated the disappearance of a federal auditor in 1987 in order to suppress documentation of a multi-county scheme to redirect federal housing funds for personal enrichment. I think the financial foundation of every Halloran-owned property in this part of Tennessee was built on the proceeds of that scheme. And I think the man who was killed for trying to report has been waiting in a paper bag under a crawl space and then under a bird bath for 38 years for somebody to finish what he started. She nodded slowly. That is a fair summary. I would add one thing. The statute of limitations on the financial crimes documented here is more complicated than it looks, because the proceeds of the original scheme have been continuously laundered into new property acquisitions for 38 years, and federal law allows the clock to start running from the date of the most recent transaction in a continuous money laundering operation. The Halloran Company closed on a property in Sweet Gum 6 weeks ago. The clock is fresh. As for the disappearance of Mr. Caldwell, and I will need to confirm his full name and trace what happened to him. There is no statute of limitations on murder. None. She paused. She looked at me. She said, Miss Ardent, I want you to be very sure of what you are about to do. The Hallorans are not what they were when your aunt put that padlock on room 12, but they are not nothing either. Garrett Halloran has connections. He has money. He has a brother-in-law who is currently the district attorney of an adjoining county. He is not the man his daddy was, but he came up under that man, and he has spent his entire adult life believing that his family is untouchable in this part of the state. If you give me these documents, and I do what I'm going to do with them, your life is going to change. You are not going to be able to walk away from this in 30 days and go home and forget about it. You are going to be a witness in a federal proceeding. You are going to give depositions. You are going to be cross-examined. The local press is going to call you. The Halloran family is going to do everything within the considerable scope of what they can do to discredit you, to intimidate you, and if any of that does not work, to silence you in less polite ways. I am telling you this not to scare you, but because your aunt did not have a choice in 1987, and you do have a choice in 2026. And I will not take this case unless you make that choice with your eyes open. Do you understand me? I understood her. I sat with the question for a long time. I thought about my Aunt Dell sitting at the same desk in 1987 with a forged signature in her register and a metal box she had just hidden under a bird bath. I thought about Mr. Caldwell walking out his room in his stocking feet because 2 men had come for him in the middle of the night. I thought about Garrett Halloran, sitting in the chair Marguerite Pell was now sitting in, smiling at me and telling me that $240,000 was the most generous offer I was going to get. Marguerite, I said, I am going to give you these documents. I am going to do exactly what you tell me to do, and I am not going to walk away. She nodded once. She did not smile. All right. The first thing we're going to do is make 6 certified copies of every document in this box, and we are going to put them in 6 different places, none of which are this motel and none of which are in Coke County. The second thing we're going to do is contact a friend of mine who is a special agent with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit out of the Knoxville field office. The third thing we're going to do is not, under any circumstances, mention any of this to Roy Petway, to the local sheriff's office, to anyone in town, or to any member of the Halloran family. Are we clear? We were clear. What happened over the next 11 weeks. I'm going to tell you more briefly than it deserves, because the courts are going to tell that story in their own time and in their own language. Marguerite Pell did exactly what she said she was going to do. The FBI agent was a woman named Sandra Whitlock, who came down from Knoxville on a Wednesday and spent 2 days at Aunt Dell's kitchen table going through the documents item by item with a forensic accountant on a video call from Atlanta. The documents were authenticated. Mr. Caldwell, full name Jerome Caldwell, originally of Bowling Green, Kentucky, was identified through fingerprint records that had been on file at the Regional Housing Authority since his hire in 1980. A missing persons report had been filed on him by his sister in May of 1987. It had gone nowhere. It was reopened the same week the documents from the metal box were authenticated. A federal grand jury was convened in Knoxville in the 8th week. The indictments came down in the 11th week. They named Garrett Halloran, 3 other men whose names were in Aunt Dell's letter, and the estate of Boyd Halloran, in connection with continuous money laundering conspiracy, fraud against the United States government, and, in the case of Garrett's brother-in-law, who turned out to have made a series of remarkably ill-advised phone calls in the days after Sandra Whitlock began her interviews, obstruction of justice. The murder investigation into Jerome Caldwell's disappearance was opened separately, and it was opened at the recommendation of Marguerite Pell, and to order the federal court, under the jurisdiction of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, with no involvement from the Cope County Sheriff's Department. Garrett Halloran came to the Blue Fern Motel one more time. It was the morning before the indictments were unsealed, although neither of us knew that yet, except that one of us did, because somebody had told him. He pulled into the parking lot in his black pickup, and he came in without knocking, the way he had the first time, and he sat down across from me at the desk, and he was not smiling. "Hollis," he said, "I want you to tell me what you have done." I sat very still, and I looked at him. He was a different man than he had been 6 weeks before. The starched shirt was wrinkled. The polished boots were dusty. The tan on his face had gone gray under the eyes. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping, and who had spent the recent past on the telephone with attorneys, and who had finally understood that morning that the situation he was in was not a situation that money was going to fix. "Garrett," I said, "I have not done anything. My aunt did, almost 40 years ago. She just took her time about it." His jaw worked. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was not the voice he had used 6 weeks before, "You do not know what you are doing. You do not know this place. You do not know what you're going to set off in this town. There are people in this county whose jobs depend on my company. There are people whose mortgages I hold. There are families. There are children. You're going to take all that down to settle a 38-year-old grudge that your aunt was too afraid to settle herself. And you are going to call it justice. It is not justice, Hollis. It is destruction. And you are going to live with the cost of it for the rest of your life." I let him talk. I let him say it all. When he was done, I waited a moment and I said, "Garrett, sit down for a second longer. I want to tell you something." He sat. "My aunt was not afraid," I said. "My aunt was alone. There is a difference. Your father stood in this office in 1987, and he told her that if she said one word about what he'd done in this parking lot, he would do something to her brother and her niece, to my father, Garrett, and to me, when I was 9 years old, that neither of us would want to talk about. He used those words. She wrote them down. She wrote them down because she understood that one day the man saying them would be dead, and she would still be standing, and she wanted there to be a record of why she had stayed quiet for so long. She was not afraid of him. She was protecting us. She was protecting me. For 38 years. I looked at him. He was not looking at me anymore. He was looking at the floor. Your father is the man who put the padlock on room 12, Garrett. Not my aunt. She just turned the key. And the only reason I am sitting here finishing what she started is because I am the niece your father threatened in 1987, and I am the only person left who is not afraid of what is going to happen when this comes out. So do not sit in that chair and tell me about destruction. Your family did the destruction. We're just turning the lights on." He sat for another long minute with his face in his hands. He was not crying. He was past crying. He was somewhere quieter than that. The place a man goes when the story is told himself about who he is for 55 years stops working all at once, and he has nowhere left to put it. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and dry. "I did not know," he said, "about Caldwell. I knew there was something. I knew my daddy had. I knew there was something he had done. I did not know the man was killed. I want you to understand that. I did not know." "I believe you," I said. "I do not know that it matters. The money you built your company on was the money your father took from that man. You inherited it. You used it. You bought houses with it. You were going to have to answer for that, whether you knew or not." He nodded. He did not argue. He stood up slowly, like a man 20 years older than he was, and he walked to the door, and he stopped with his hand on the handle, and he said, without turning around, "Your aunt, was she ever happy here?" I thought about that for a moment. I thought about Aunt Dell at her kitchen table, her strong hands flat on the wood, her face composed in the way it had always been composed. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories on screen right now.